The autumn wind swept through the courtyard of Valdres Palace as Captain Marcus Thornfield adjusted his ceremonial sword for the 100th time that morning. 23 years of service to the crown had taught him that royal ceremonies were equal parts tradition and theater. But today felt different. Today, Queen Isabella would be presenting the crown of succession to her stepson, Prince Adrian, officially naming him heir to the throne of Valdres. Marcus had served 3 generations of the royal family. He remembered when King Edmund first brought his young bride Isabella to the palace 15 years ago. The servants whispered then about the beautiful widow who had captured the king's heart just 2 years after Queen Catherine's death. Marcus had watched Prince Adrian, barely 8 years old, struggle to accept his new stepmother while grieving his beloved mother. The captain's weathered hands trembled slightly as he thought about the events that had led to this day. 6 months ago, King Edmund had died suddenly of a heart attack during his morning ride. The kingdom mourned their beloved ruler, but questions arose immediately about the succession. According to ancient law, Prince Adrian should have been crowned immediately upon his father's death. Instead, Queen Isabella had declared herself regent, claiming the prince was too young and inexperienced to rule at 23. "Captain Thornfield," a sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Marcus turned to see Lady Evangeline, Queen Isabella's chief advisor, approaching with her usual air of superiority. Her silk gown rustled against the stone floor as she walked, her pale eyes calculating and cold. "The Queen requires your presence in the throne room immediately," Lady Evangeline announced, her voice carrying the authority she wielded on behalf of her mistress. "There have been changes to today's ceremony protocol." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. Protocol changes on the day of a major ceremony were unusual and often problematic. As the head of the Queen's Guard, he was responsible for ensuring the safety and security of all royal events. Any last-minute alterations could compromise the carefully planned security measures. The throne room was dimly lit when Marcus entered, with only a few candles casting dancing shadows on the ancient tapestries that lined the walls. Queen Isabella sat upon the golden throne that had belonged to her late husband, her presence commanding despite her petite frame. She wore a deep purple gown embroidered with silver threads, and the crown jewels glittered against her dark hair. At 38, she remained strikingly beautiful, but Marcus had learned to be wary of the calculating intelligence that lurked behind her green eyes. "Captain," Queen Isabella's voice was honey-sweet, but Marcus detected the steel beneath. "I trust you understand the significance of today's ceremony." "Yes, Your Majesty. Prince Adrian will be presented with the crown of succession, formally recognizing him as heir to the throne." Marcus kept his voice steady and professional, though he wondered why she needed to discuss something so obvious. Queen Isabella smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Indeed. However, there will be a slight modification to the traditional ceremony. When Prince Adrian kneels to receive the crown, I want you to kneel as well, as a symbol of the Guard's loyalty to the new arrangement." Marcus felt his breath catch. In all his years of service, the captain of the Guard had never knelt during a succession ceremony. The Guard knelt only to the reigning monarch, never to an heir. It was a tradition stretching back centuries, designed to maintain the clear distinction between the ruler and those who would one day rule. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "tradition dictates that the Guard remains standing during succession ceremonies. We kneel only to the crowned sovereign." "Tradition?" Queen Isabella repeated, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Sometimes traditions must evolve, Captain. The kingdom has been through tremendous upheaval since my husband's death. The people need to see unity, stability, and clear lines of authority. Your kneeling will demonstrate that the Guard serves the crown, regardless of who wears it." Marcus felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His father had served as captain of the Guard before him, and his grandfather before that. The Thornfield family had protected the royal family for 3 generations, always adhering strictly to protocol and tradition. To kneel when tradition demanded he stand would be more than a simple gesture. It would be a fundamental alteration of his oath and duties. "I understand your desire for unity, Your Majesty," Marcus replied slowly. "But changing centuries-old protocol without consulting the Royal Council seems premature. Perhaps we should—" "The Royal Council serves at my pleasure," Queen Isabella interrupted, rising from the throne. "As do you, Captain. I am not making a request. I am giving you a direct order." The throne room fell silent, except for the crackling of the candles. Marcus felt Lady Evangeline's eyes upon him, watching for any sign of defiance. He had sworn an oath to serve and protect the royal family, but he had also sworn to uphold the traditions and laws of Valdres. Those two oaths had never conflicted before today. "Your Majesty," Marcus said finally, his voice steadied despite the turmoil in his heart. "I have served your family faithfully for over 2 decades. I served your late husband with honor, and I have protected you and Prince Adrian with my life. But I cannot, in good conscience, alter sacred protocol without proper deliberation and approval from the appropriate authorities." Queen Isabella's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, Marcus saw past her composed facade to the ruthless ambition beneath. "You forget yourself, Captain. I am the Queen Regent of Valdres, and I have absolute authority until Prince Adrian's coronation. Your oath is to the crown, and I wear that crown." "With respect, Your Majesty, you wear the crown of a regent, not a sovereign. My oath was to King Edmund and the Kingdom of Valdres. Prince Adrian is the rightful heir, and until he is crowned, my duty is to uphold the laws and traditions that govern our realm." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he waited for Queen Isabella's response. Lady Evangeline had gone pale, clearly shocked by his open defiance of the Queen's direct order. Queen Isabella descended the steps of the throne slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. When she reached Marcus, she stood directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell her perfume and see the fury burning in her eyes. "You would dare defy me?" she whispered, her voice deadly quiet. "I serve the crown and the kingdom, Your Majesty, not personal ambitions." The words hung in the air between them like a sword. Marcus knew he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. He had served loyally and without question for decades, but today, something deep inside him rebelled against what he saw as a fundamental betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. Queen Isabella's smile was cold as winter frost. "Very well, Captain Thornfield. If you will not kneel willingly, perhaps you need time to reconsider your position. Guards!" The sound of armored footsteps echoed through the throne room as 4 guards entered. Marcus recognized them all, men he had trained, men who had served under his command for years. Their faces showed confusion and distress at being called to arrest their own captain. "Escort Captain Thornfield to the tower," Queen Isabella commanded. "He can contemplate his loyalty in solitude until he comes to his senses." As the guards approached hesitantly, Marcus straightened his shoulders and looked each of them in the eye. "Remember your oaths, men. Remember who you truly serve." The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Marcus was led through the palace corridors toward the tower that had once been used to imprison enemies of the crown. Servants and courtiers stopped their activities to stare in shock as the respected captain of the guard was marched past in disgrace. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared in disbelief. As they climbed the narrow stone steps to his cell, Marcus thought about Prince Adrian. The young man deserved better than the political games being played around him. He deserved the throne that was rightfully his, and he deserved protectors who would not bend to pressure when it mattered most. The cell door clanged shut behind him, and Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts and his conscience. Through the small barred window, he could see the courtyard, where the succession ceremony would take place in just a few hours. He wondered if his defiance would matter, or if Queen Isabella would simply find another way to get what she wanted. One thing was certain. The events of this day would change the kingdom of Valdres forever, and Captain Marcus Thornfield had chosen to stand on the side of tradition and honor, whatever the cost might be. The tower cell was cold and damp, with only a thin shaft of sunlight streaming through the barred window to illuminate the stone walls that had held countless prisoners over the centuries. Marcus sat on the rough wooden bench, his mind racing as he considered the implications of his defiance. Below in the courtyard, he could hear the bustling preparations for the succession ceremony, servants arranging chairs, musicians tuning their instruments, and guards taking their positions. A soft knock on the cell door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up in surprise as the heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing Prince Adrian himself. The young man's face was pale with worry, his usually perfectly styled brown hair disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Captain," Prince Adrian whispered urgently, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I came as soon as I heard. This is madness. Why has my stepmother imprisoned you?" Marcus rose to his feet and bowed slightly, maintaining proper protocol even in his current circumstances. "Your Highness, you shouldn't be here. If Queen Isabella discovers you've come to see me, it could make matters worse for both of us." Prince Adrian stepped into the cell, his jaw set with determination that reminded Marcus of his late father. "I don't care about her anger anymore, Captain. I've heard whispers about what happened in the throne room. Is it true that she ordered you to kneel during the ceremony?" The pain in the young prince's eyes cut Marcus to the core. Adrian had grown up watching the subtle manipulations and power plays that had surrounded his stepmother's rise to influence. He had seen trusted advisors disappear, family friends distanced, and traditions slowly eroded in favor of Isabella's preferences. "Your Highness, my duty is to uphold the traditions and laws of this kingdom," Marcus replied carefully. "Sometimes that duty conflicts with personal requests, even from those in positions of authority." Adrian's fists clenched at his sides. "She's using my succession ceremony to legitimize her power grab, isn't she? By making you kneel, she's trying to demonstrate that even the most loyal servants of the crown answer to her rather than to me or to tradition." Marcus was impressed by the young man's political insight. Adrian had always been intelligent, but recent months had forced him to mature quickly as he navigated the treacherous waters of palace intrigue. "You understand the implications better than most, Your Highness," Marcus acknowledged. "The ceremony should be about your rightful claim to the throne, not about reinforcing anyone else's authority." A commotion in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. Prince Adrian quickly pressed himself against the wall beside the door as footsteps approached. Marcus recognized the authoritative stride of Sir Edmund Blackwood, the Queen's personal guard captain who had been appointed after Isabella became regent. "Prince Adrian," Sir Edmund's voice called from outside the cell. "Your Highness, you are needed for final preparations. The ceremony begins within the hour." Adrian looked at Marcus with desperate eyes, clearly torn between his duty to attend the ceremony and his desire to find a solution to the current crisis. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod. "Go, Your Highness," he whispered. "This is your day, regardless of the complications. The kingdom needs to see you claim your birthright." With obvious reluctance, Adrian straightened his shoulders and stepped out of the cell. "I'm here, Sir Edmund," he called, his voice steady despite the emotions Marcus could see he was struggling to contain. As their footsteps faded down the corridor, Marcus returned to the window and watched the final preparations below. Noble families from across the kingdom had gathered in the courtyard, dressed in their finest attire. foreign dignitaries occupied a section of honored seats, representing kingdoms with whom Valdres maintained important alliances. The ceremony would be witnessed by hundreds of people, making it a pivotal moment for the realm's future. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as trumpets announced the beginning of the ceremony. Marcus pressed his face closer to the bars, watching as Queen Isabella emerged from the palace wearing an elaborate gold gown and the crown of state. She moved with practiced grace, acknowledging the assembled nobles with regal nods and carefully calculated smiles. Prince Adrian followed several paces behind, dressed in the traditional white and gold ceremonial robes of an heir. Even from his distant vantage point, Marcus could see the tension in the young man's posture. Adrian's face was composed, but his movements seemed slightly stiff, as if he were forcing himself to maintain control. As the royal party took their positions on the raised platform at the center of the courtyard, Marcus noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Sir Edmund Blackwood had positioned additional guards around the platform, more than were typically required for a succession ceremony. Their placement suggested they were there not just for protection, but for control. The ceremony began with ancient words spoken by the Archbishop of Valdres, his elderly voice carrying across the silent courtyard as he recited the traditional invocations. The crowd listened with reverent attention as he spoke of divine right, hereditary duty, and the sacred bond between ruler and realm. When the moment came for the presentation of the crown of succession, Queen Isabella stepped forward with theatrical precision. She lifted the ancient silver crown, its surface gleaming with embedded sapphires that had been mined from Valdres's own mountains centuries earlier. "Prince Adrian of Valdres," her voice rang out clearly, "do you swear to uphold the laws and traditions of this realm, to protect its people, and to serve with wisdom and courage when called upon to rule?" "I so swear," Adrian replied, his voice strong despite the circumstances. It was then that Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. As Prince Adrian began to kneel to receive the crown, Queen Isabella's eyes swept the assembled crowd until they found the guards who would normally be commanded by Marcus. Her gaze was expectant, commanding, as if she still believed they would follow her earlier order to kneel. The guards, however, remained standing. Marcus felt a surge of pride as he watched his men maintain their positions, honoring the traditions they had sworn to uphold. Their faces showed confusion and uncertainty, but they stood firm, apparently deciding that without their captain present to countermand their understanding of protocol, they would follow established tradition. Queen Isabella's moment of hesitation was barely perceptible, but Marcus caught it. Her carefully orchestrated plan to demonstrate absolute authority was crumbling before the eyes of the kingdom's most important witnesses. The foreign dignitaries, the noble families, and the palace servants were all observing a succession ceremony where the Queen Regent's will was being quietly but definitively challenged. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Prince Adrian remained kneeling, waiting for the crown to be placed upon his head. The Archbishop looked between the Queen and the Prince uncertainly, sensing that something was amiss but unsure what role he should play in resolving the situation. Finally, Queen Isabella placed the crown of succession on Prince Adrian's head, completing the ceremony despite the public demonstration that her authority was not as absolute as she had hoped. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Marcus could see the fury burning in the Queen's eyes as she smiled and waved to acknowledge their celebration. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse for the evening's feast, Marcus saw Prince Adrian glance up toward the tower where he was imprisoned. Even from that distance, the young man's expression conveyed both gratitude and determination. The real battle for the kingdom's future was just beginning, and both men understood that the events of this day had set forces in motion that could not be easily stopped. The sun was setting over Valdres as Marcus contemplated what tomorrow might bring. His act of defiance had succeeded in preserving an important tradition, But it had also escalated the conflict between those who served the rightful heir and those who served the Queen Regent's ambitions. The kingdom stood at a crossroads, and Captain Marcus Thornfield remained determined to help guide it toward the path of honor and justice, regardless of the personal cost. The night was long and restless for Marcus as he remained confined in the tower cell, listening to the distant sounds of celebration echoing from the palace's great hall. The succession ceremony feast would continue until dawn, but Marcus knew that beneath the revelry, serious conversations were taking place among the kingdom's most powerful nobles. His public defiance of Queen Isabella had sent ripples throughout the court, and those ripples would soon become waves. As the first pale light of dawn crept through his cell window, Marcus heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy boots of guards, but the lighter steps of someone moving stealthily through the corridors. The cell door opened quietly, revealing a figure in a dark hooded cloak. When the person lowered the hood, Marcus was surprised to see Lady Catherine Ashford, one of the kingdom's most respected nobles and a close friend of the late King Edmund. "Captain Thornfield," she whispered urgently, "we must move quickly. Prince Adrian has called an emergency session of the Royal Council, and your testimony is required." Marcus stood slowly, his joints stiff from the uncomfortable night on the wooden bench. "Lady Ashford, how is this possible? Queen Isabella would never authorize my release." A slight smile crossed Lady Catherine's weathered face. "The Queen Regent's authority is not as absolute as she believes. Prince Adrian invoked an ancient law that grants the heir apparent the right to convene the Royal Council in matters of succession protocol. Several key nobles have supported his petition, particularly after witnessing yesterday's events." As they moved quietly through the palace corridors, Lady Catherine explained what had transpired during the feast. "Your stand yesterday gave others the courage to speak openly about their concerns. Lord Reginald Pemberton publicly questioned the legitimacy of recent changes to palace protocol. Lady Margaret Westbrook reminded everyone that tradition exists to protect the crown from the whims of any single individual. By midnight, half the Royal Council was calling for a formal review of the regency. They reached the council chamber just as the morning bells began to chime. The great oak doors stood open, revealing a room filled with tension. The 12 members of the Royal Council sat around the ancient circular table, their faces grave with the weight of the decisions they faced. Prince Adrian occupied his rightful seat at the head of the table, still wearing the crown of succession from the previous day's ceremony. Queen Isabella sat to his right, her position as regent still technically intact, but her usual commanding presence seemed diminished. Lady Evangeline stood behind her, whispering urgently in her ear, but the Queen's responses were sharp and dismissive. "Captain Thornfield," Prince Adrian's voice carried across the chamber as Marcus entered, "we thank you for joining us. The Royal Council is convening to address questions of protocol and authority that arose during yesterday's ceremony." Lord Reginald Pemberton, the oldest member of the council and a man whose family had served the crown for 6 generations, leaned forward in his chair. "Captain, you served under 3 kings before yesterday's events. In all your years of service, has a captain of the guard ever been ordered to kneel during a succession ceremony?" "Never, my lord," Marcus replied firmly. "The guard kneels only to the crowned sovereign, as established by the founding accords of Valdres. This tradition ensures the military remains loyal to the crown itself, not to any individual who might temporarily hold authority." Queen Isabella's eyes flashed with anger. "This council has no authority to question my decisions as regent. I acted to demonstrate unity and stability during a difficult transition." "With respect, Your Majesty," interrupted Lady Margaret Westbrook, "the regency was always intended to be a temporary stewardship, not an opportunity to fundamentally alter our kingdom's most sacred traditions. The captain's refusal to obey an order that violated his oath demonstrates exactly the kind of principled leadership our realm needs. The debate continued for hours as council members examined ancient texts, consulted legal precedents, and heard testimony from various palace officials. Marcus watched Prince Adrian carefully throughout the proceedings, noting how the young man listened thoughtfully to each argument, asked pointed questions, and demonstrated wisdom beyond his years. As the afternoon sun streamed through the chamber's tall windows, Archbishop Benedict rose to address the council. His ancient voice carried the weight of religious authority as he spoke. "I have consulted the sacred chronicles and the divine mandates that govern royal succession," he announced. "The traditions that Captain Thornfield defended yesterday are not mere customs. They are spiritual and legal protections established by our ancestors to safeguard the realm from the very situation we now face." Queen Isabella stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "This is absurd. I have governed this kingdom responsibly for 6 months while Adrian learned the complexities of rulership. Everything I have done has been for the good of Valdres." "Your Majesty." Prince Adrian's voice cut through the tension with quiet authority. "No one questions your dedication or your service during Father's absence. However, the events of yesterday have shown that the time has come for me to assume full responsibility for the crown." The chamber fell silent as the full implications of his words settled over the assembled nobles. Marcus felt his heart swell with pride as he watched the young man he had helped protect throughout his childhood finally claim his birthright with dignity and determination. "I hereby formally request that the Royal Council recognize my right to immediate coronation as King of Valdres," Adrian continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The succession ceremony was completed yesterday, and I am prepared to take the oath of sovereignty before this council and before God." Lord Pemberton was the first to respond. "I second Prince Adrian's request and call for an immediate vote of the Royal Council." One by one, the council members cast their votes. The ancient tradition required a majority of 8 votes from the 12-member council to approve a coronation outside of the normal succession timeline. As each member spoke their decision, it became clear that Adrian's request would be granted. Even some of Queen Isabella's supporters recognized that the kingdom needed the stability that only a fully legitimate monarch could provide. When the final vote was counted, 9 members had supported immediate coronation. Queen Isabella sat in stunned silence as the reality of her situation became clear. Her regency was ending, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the steady application of law and tradition. "Very well," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this is the will of the council, I will step aside." The coronation took place 3 days later in the great cathedral of Valdres, with representatives from across the kingdom and neighboring realms in attendance. Marcus stood at his traditional post beside the throne, wearing his dress uniform with the special insignia that marked him as captain of the guard. His brief imprisonment had become a symbol of principled resistance throughout the kingdom, earning him respect that transcended his military rank. As Archbishop Benedict placed the crown of Valdres upon Adrian's head and proclaimed him King Adrian I, Marcus reflected on the events that had brought them to this moment. His refusal to kneel had been a simple act of conscience, but it had sparked a series of events that ultimately preserved the kingdom's constitutional order. Queen Isabella remained at court, accepting the honorific title of Queen Mother and maintaining her dignity despite the dramatic change in her circumstances. Lady Evangeline quietly retired to her family estates, while several other supporters of the Regency accepted new roles in the reformed administration. In the months that followed, King Adrian proved to be a wise and capable ruler, consulting regularly with the Royal Council and maintaining the traditions that had served Valdres well for centuries. He appointed Marcus as his chief military advisor, recognizing that the captain's principled stand had been motivated by love of country rather than personal ambition. Years later, when young guards asked Marcus about that pivotal day, he would tell them that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the courage to say no when tradition and conscience demand it. The kingdom of Valdres had been tested by the ambitions of those who would change its fundamental character, but it had emerged stronger because individuals were willing to stand for principles greater than themselves. Captain Marcus Thornfield had served 3 kings faithfully, but his greatest service to the crown had been his refusal to compromise the sacred oaths that protected the realm from the whims of any single person, no matter how powerful they might be.